We stepped into the trees before the sky remembered its color, long before the waking world could claim us back. The trail was nothing more than a seam of frost stitched through dead needles and blown leaves, a brushed silver thread leading into a pelt of black timber. Breath drifted from our mouths and broke apart in the cold. The forest swallowed each step and gave nothing in return. This is how it starts, not with spectacle, but with a hush that feels deliberate, like a hand held over a mouth. We had chased rumors before, worn the shape of skeptics and believers on alternating days, but this place did not care what we brought. The line on the map cut through old logging roads, through a shuttered hunting camp whose tin roofs slumped like fallen traps, through a gully where floodwater once ran strong enough to carry deer bones. The air tasted like iron filings and pine pitch. Everything seemed a little older than it should be, as if the land had waited too long to exhale. We set the first recorder where the trail narrowed between two black spruces, the kind that grow close and whisper to each other when no one is listening. The red tally light winked once and steadied. Farther in, a second recorder faced the mouth of a dry ravine, its bed veined with roots like knuckles under skin. Night vision glass hung against our chests, knocking quietly with our hearts. The thermal picked out dull stones and the soft star of a squirrel buried in a snag. Nothing else radiant, nothing else moving. The world had pressed pause. Local stories had described a shape more rumor than animal. Tall through the torso, impossible in the calf, shoulders like a man but wrong in the angle of the neck. They never set eyes until the end, as if holding that detail back for themselves. They said the sound came first. They said the woods remembered those who stayed too long. They said a name none of us repeated. Some legends grow new teeth every time they are told. Some keep the same bite. We followed a faded skid trail to the hollow tree the locals marked on our printout. It was not hollow like a storybook, with a door cut neatly for fox or child. It had been opened from within. The trunk split in three, and the cavity inside smelled like wet hide. The ground around it carried the small sifts and slides of animals that moved by night, but one mark lay clean as scripture. 3 vertical gouges scored through lichen and young bark, not broad, not theatrical, just firm and deep and patient. A warning written in wood. The sky dulled to slate. Thin light washed through the canopy and made the frost glow in seams and islands. We lifted the lens and framed the tree and the long corridor of trunks behind it. The world did not center for us. It never does. When we panned left, a figure rose for a heartbeat from behind a deadfall and was gone again before the brain could stamp a shape on it. The lens caught only absence. The eye kept the remainder. That is how dread works. It opens your memory and writes in shorthand. We carried our gear higher and stopped where wind should have been. Every branch stood still. No murmur, no rattle, no sift of needles. It felt like walking into a church when no one else is there and every board remembers funerals. The thermal glanced along the understory and traced nothing warm beyond our own bodies. The recorder at our hip ticked time none of us wanted to hear. We made our circle and stood with our backs outward, and for a long minute the forest matched our breath. Something changed near the ravine. Not a sound at first, a pressure, a small subtraction of courage. The tally light on the distant recorder blinked and then steadied again. But in that blink, our nerves found their teeth. The first sound was not the classic thing from fireside retellings. It was a low, almost conversational burr stretched past the length of a normal breath, a tone that sat in the ribs rather than the ear. The earth under our boots seemed to agree with it. We felt the shape of that sound before we admitted it was a sound. We slid toward the ravine a step at a time, and the frost broke underfoot like old glass. The thermal painted the gulch with patient gray and then hiccuped on something warmer. Then stone, cooler than deer. A curve, then nothing. We kept the camera high. The recorder on the lip caught the second sound, longer and hollowed in the middle. A throat opened to more air than lungs can carry. The body reads meaning in tones even when the mind refuses. The hair along the forearms becomes a barometer. The stomach becomes a stone. The hollow tree watched us from behind. The gouges in the bark caught the new light and deepened. We found more marks on the way back, not clustered to frighten tourists, but spaced like milestones. A branch against another branch at shoulder height had been turned until the cambium shone pale. Sap wept slow and sticky, a small, bright wound. Farther on, a line of prints stepped in and out of itself in a way that refused simple anatomy. Heel where toe should live. Depth without weight. A long stride that shortened when the ground steepened. As if the earth had changed its mind about physics and the thing had agreed. The third sound came from everywhere at once. The ravine gave it a throat, the spruce needles gave it teeth, and the open sky delivered it back to us, shaped like a name. Every howl is a name forgotten. The recorder clipped and recovered. The camera wavered and held steady because our hands would not. We did not speak. We did not need to. The forest spoke its side, and it did not care to be understood. We kept moving, not forward and not back, but along the seam between both. The path narrowed and then disappeared under a mat of windfall that had fallen on a day without wind. We stepped over trunks, scratched in threes. We passed a blind of woven limbs that had not grown that way. The light learned how to die earlier than forecast. Shadows gathered in the low places, like water pooling before a freeze. We did not hear it then. We only felt the pause that followed, the breath the forest held, the kind of silence that means something has changed its mind about you. In that silence, the recorder caught a single thread of sound beneath the wind, too soft to register in the moment. Later, under headphones, it would be clear, a breath drawn close to the mic. Then words stretched thin as frost. They hunt the unsubscribed first. When the wind finally returned, it carried no scent but cold. The tally lights burned small and faithful. We marked our time and marked our exit, but the route felt altered, as if the forest had pulled one thread and retied it behind us. We stepped into the last stretch of birch where bark peels like old letters. Far ahead, 2 points of color hung at the height of a man and did not blink. The night vision glass found them, and they found us back. They held, they went out. The woods remembered the old silence. The recorders remembered everything else. Daylight in these woods does not arrive like it does anywhere else. It seeps, slow and pale, as though the sun has to force its way through something older than clouds. When it comes, it changes nothing. The trees still lean in close, the soil still feels damp even when it has not rained, and the air keeps the weight of the night clinging to it like smoke. We made camp on a small rise between 2 logging scars. Ground littered with pine cones and old beer tabs from men who came here to hunt deer but left with their eyes fixed on something else entirely. The morning routine was all function, a map, laid flat on the hood of the truck, gloved fingers tracing the contour lines that led to the oldest sightings. 2 aerial photographs of the same ridge, taken decades apart, showing a patch of forest that had grown denser instead of thinning, as most do with age. Radios checked for range, batteries replaced. It was the rhythm of an investigation, each task unremarkable, each movement carrying a low hum of purpose. The locals who spoke to us had done so in the same guarded way, eyes on the road, or on the ground, or on the rim of their coffee. They said the sound was worse than the sight, because you could not be sure where it was coming from, and sometimes it would not stop for hours. They said the prints didn't match any book they'd ever owned, and they had owned many. They said the dogs went silent a week before the first scream, and the silence was harder to live with than the scream itself. We carried those scraps with us, not as evidence, but as warnings we would not admit out loud. Around midday, the forest offered its first small betrayal. A trail camera placed the previous season had been twisted clean from its mount and left face down in the duff. The metal bracket was bent in 2 places, not crushed, just forced in a deliberate direction. No claw marks, no bite. Only the kind of strength that works slowly enough to keep from breaking the plastic housing. We replaced it with one of ours, a new lens facing the same stretch of narrow game trail that cut toward a tangle of deadwood. Like a skeletal fence, the hours bled quietly. We moved in pairs and sometimes alone, circling back to the rise, marking points on the map. and speaking in low tones over the radios. The frost began to break, releasing the smell of damp earth and old leaves. Somewhere distant, a woodpecker worked a trunk in sharp, even beats, but the sound never carried far. The ridge ahead was wrapped in an odd stillness, like a hill holding its breath. When we climbed it, the wind shifted in a way that felt more like posture than chance. Tracks appeared along the southern slope, where the ground dipped just enough to hold meltwater. At first they were coyote, clean pads and claws in the thawed soil. Then, without warning, the pattern altered. Toes lengthened, the heel pressed deeper. A faint arc appeared on the outer edge, as if weight had shifted onto a foot not shaped for this ground. The stride lengthened, the angle narrowed. A dozen steps later, the impressions stopped completely. No scatter, no leap, no return path. Just ended, as though the maker had stepped into air. By late afternoon, the light began to drain from the hollows. We sat near the old fire ring at camp, scanning the tree line and letting the stillness press in. The fire ring was littered with small bones, bleached and dry, not deer or rabbit, but something closer to raccoon. Some had been gnawed, others cracked clean in half. The smell of rust hung faint in the air, though no metal was near. In the center of the ring, under a scatter of needles, a patch of earth had been turned, the soil darker and more compact than the rest. We ate in silence, each bite feeling like a distraction from something we should have been noticing. The radios hissed occasionally with bursts of static that carried no pattern. Beyond the ring of camp, the trees had darkened into silhouettes against a sky that no longer promised clear weather. The last errands of daylight were quick, checking batteries again, tightening straps on packs, marking the first GPS points where the tracks had broken their own pattern. In the low hiss of the radio, static shifted into a single pulse and broke apart into nothing, leaving only a faint aftertaste of sound in the air. If played back, it might be nothing more than interference. Or it might be a voice dragging itself through the channel, murmuring low enough to make the skin prickle. Only those who click survive the transformation. When darkness folded itself over the ridge, it did so without a horizon. One moment, the shapes around us were trees and rocks and the curve of the hill. The next, they were simply absence. Headlamps cast beams that fell short, light swallowed before it could name anything. The cold deepened and settled over us like a damp sheet. Somewhere out there, just beyond the reach of our light, a branch flexed once and held as if it had been waiting for the dark to move. There are nights when you feel watched and dismiss it. And there are nights when the sensation roots itself in the spine and refuses to be reasoned away. This was the latter. It came without sound, without movement we could trace, only the persistent, crawling awareness that every turn of the head was being matched from somewhere else. The longer it lasted, the harder it became to convince ourselves it was only the forest. The line between normal and not had already started to thin. It would only get thinner from here. Night in these woods is not a change of light, but a change of temperature in the soul. It seeps in, cold and unshakable, a tide that rises behind the ribs until every breath feels borrowed. We moved from camp in a slow arc toward the southern edge of the ridge, the place where the tracks had stopped, as if their maker had been lifted away. The beam of the thermal camera cut shallow into the dark, spilling shapes that lived only in shades of heat. Stones still holding the memory of the day, the lean warmth of a fox slipping through brush, the dim pulse of our own bodies framed in shadow. Beyond that, nothing. The first sound came soft enough to pretend it was wind. A low drawn-out rush that seemed to move along the tree line rather than through it. The second sound followed almost immediately, sharper, placed just far enough away to make the mind build a shape to match it. We stood still, headlamps off, letting our ears do the work. The forest answered by holding itself absolutely still. Every sound we knew belonged here had been cut away, leaving only the foreign ones to mark the silence. We reached the break where the slope bled into a flat stretch of damp ground. The mud there was laced with tracks. Deer at first, then coyote. Both turned sharply at the same place, avoiding a shallow trough in the earth that smelled faintly of wet fur and metal. The edges of the trough were pressed flat, as if something heavy had lain there, just long enough to warm the soil and then rise without disturbing it further. The pattern of needles around it had been rearranged, small spirals radiating out from the center. They did not move in the wind. A burst of static crackled through the radio at my hip, followed by a fragment of something that was not speech, but carried the rhythm of it. It came low and clipped, like syllables stripped of their consonants. We froze, waiting for it to repeat. Instead, the static ebbed into a thin hiss, and beneath that hiss was a murmur so soft it might have been imagined. Later, on playback, the words would be clear enough to catch. He still waits beneath the hollow tree. We had not been near that marker since the previous morning, yet the voice carried the damp weight of closeness. We pushed deeper, the ground growing softer underfoot, the air thickening with that faint, metallic taste that so often precedes blood. The thermal camera caught a flicker between two poplars, a brief heat signature taller than a man, narrowing at the waist, flaring again at the shoulders. It did not move like a deer or bear. It simply leaned forward once, the way a man might when trying to see without being seen, and then slid back into absence. The reading on the screen bled away almost instantly, as if it had never been there. The darkness here seemed to grow teeth. Not in the way it bit at the skin with cold, but in the way it worried at the mind, gnawing small holes in reason. Every step forward felt answered by something unseen, adjusting its own position. The arc of our lights caught fresh marks along a cedar's trunk, 3 deep grooves cut clean through bark into pale flesh. They were placed higher than a man could reach without climbing, each one evenly spaced, each one dragging downward at the same deliberate angle. In the corner of my vision, something shifted between the trees. By the time the lens found it, there was nothing but the sway of a branch. The air felt pressed down, as if the forest were leaning its full weight on our shoulders. A faint rhythm joined the stillness, not a footstep, but the measured sound of breath. Too steady to belong to the wind, too close to ignore. It circled, tightening, closing the gaps we had left between us and the dark. The radio hissed again, but this time the static broke into a sound halfway between a growl and a whisper. The words were gone, but the intent remained, curling through the speaker and into the base of the spine. It came from the channel no one had been speaking on. The headset warmed against my ear. I could smell earth on the wind now, deep and old, as if something had been turned over far beneath the ground. We stood there, lights trained into the void, thermal sweeping back and forth across trunks and open spaces. The forest did not give us eyeshine or silhouette, only the sense that whatever had been moving was no longer moving at all, because it had already arrived. The cold pulled heavier around our legs. Somewhere in the black, something wet struck the ground, a slow and deliberate patter like water falling from a height. We did not move toward it. They track by scent, and you've lingered here too long. Subscribe to escape. The words did not come from any mouth among us, but the meaning clung just as surely as the cold. The forest kept its secrets, but the air told us one thing. We were already marked. The ridge tightened into a spine and carried us along it, like teeth guiding a thread. The air thinned and sharpened until every inhale felt filed to an edge. We moved single file because the ground allowed nothing else. Boots, finding the dark well of roots, knees brushing, cedar tips, wet with a cold that did not belong to weather. The forest had finished its considering and settled on us. That was the sense of it, a decision made behind the bark and under the needles. A verdict passed without sound. It began with the smell, not rot, not musk, something cleaner and more clinical, the sterile tang of a room where bone is shown to daylight. The thermal flickered and steadied, and then refused to hold anything in its eye that was not us. Ahead, a break in the trees opened into a shallow bowl, a small amphitheater of earth with an ancient stump at its center. The stump was ringed by gouges, fresh on fresh, years layered into a single intention. Sap bled slow and amber along the cuts until moonlight turned it to small coins. We circled the bowl. Mud clung to the ankles in a way that suggested hands. Each step rose with more weight than it should have carried. Something had come here to lie down, and had risen wrong. The ground held a wide depressional print stretched too long in the mid, a pressure ridge at the heel, and a series of shallow crescents at the fore that overlapped like a fan opening and closing. The mind knows what it is being asked to accept and resists as long as it can. The body does not argue. The body simply readies. From the far rim of the bowl came a soft separation of branches that did not topple back into place. A shape itself from the wall of trees, more absence than presence, until it caught the small, meager birth of the moon, and the absence learned a border. Not the full thing. Enough. The head carried the wrong slope. A long muzzle lifted to catch the air. The ears pressed back, not like fear, but like focus. The shoulders rising into a ridge too high for human proportion. The legs in front were a compromise between two worlds and working to please neither. The back legs bent with a patience unfamiliar to deer or man. It leaned its weight forward and tested us with stillness. There is a moment when the brain tries to redraw the lines of the world and does it so fast, you can hear the chalk. That moment came and left a smear of noise in the skull, like teeth grinding under stress. The thing remained where it had chosen to be. Moonlight threaded its fur in places, not evenly, not kindly. The color lived in the eyes, but not as glow, more like possession. It breathed in a rhythm we recognized, a long measure taken from chests, and returned, altered. One of us broke. It was not the loudness of panic, but the accuracy of it. A clean motion. A hand reached to the radio and clicked it down to silence. Another found the headlamp and cupped it, starving the beam until only a throat of light remained. Then that same hand slid to the pack and closed around the keys to the truck and the sat phone that lived in the top pouch. The weight of departure changed the air. The rest of us felt it at once. The small vacuum a choice leaves behind. Abandonment has its own temperature. It found our skin and stayed. The thing in the trees made no lunge and no bluff. It flexed one hand into earth and left crescents in wet soil like signatures. The fingers were too long, the nails too thick. Not claws in the way a bear shows them, but a different tool built for a different violence. The head tipped, as if measuring us for the last time we would ever be measured. In the quiet, something shifted inside the stump at the center of the bowl, and the sound of it carried like enamel cracking in a cold glass. It was small, and it was final, and it belonged in a mouth. A coiled ache gathered high in the gums behind the teeth. Sympathetic and undeniable, as if the body had decided to mirror the sound with a ghost of its own. Fingernails tightened in their beds and threatened to lift. Eyes watered without warning and held a shallow sheen that turned every spark of moon to a needle. The forest did not move closer. It forced us to feel closer to it. That was the confirmation. Not the sight, not the print, but the way our own selves began to hitch against their seams. The one who had taken the keys stepped backward along the line of our footprints and was gone, swallowed by the same corridor we had carved to reach this place. The radios no longer burred with friendly noise. The engine we did not yet hear became a promise we would not be offered. We were smaller by one and larger by the hole that one left. Fear took the shape of a map with edges burned away. The bowl held its breath until ours grew ragged. The thing shifted its weight and pulled one hand free. Mud came with it in dark ribbons. It raised its head not to call, but to breathe more of us, and the air between us and it became the rope in a ritual we had not agreed to. The gouged stump gave a wet sigh that lived somewhere between wood and animal. Every howl is a name forgotten. The mind supplied, and this was the mouth that taught the lesson. We did not run. Running would have been a gift. We backed out along the ridge, and the shape receded by inches as if bound to a circle we could not see. When the last of the bowl slipped behind trunks, sound returned in tatters. Small forest noises crawling back into the edges of perception, like animals into a den after a storm. The radio at my hip woke on its own and dragged a length of static across the channel, like metal across stone. Beneath it, too soft to claim and too clear to ignore, a breath spoke of the next turning of the moon and what it expects. Tell us your story before the next full moon, or you will hear the howl at your door. The words wore no human mouth. They wore the forest. We reached the cut, where the ridge softens and spills into the old road, and the absence of the truck stood ahead, like a darkened window. The cold rose to meet us as though it had been wading in the ruts behind. The bowl and its patient occupant sank into the timber until only the ache in our teeth testified that any of it had happened. The curse did not need a bite to travel. It needed only proximity and the small betrayals living things make when night offers them an exit. Night came with the color of old iron and the certainty of debt. The ridge gave way to low ground, ribbed with roots and choked by deadfall, the sort of place that remembers floods and keeps the memory damp. We moved without speaking, smaller than the dark and shaped by it, our breath a thin seam stitching one patch of black to the next. The sky above the canopy reddened in a way the forecast had not promised. The moon, lifting through a skin of cloud like an ember pressed under gauze. Red moon meant nothing to the new maps. But the old stories nodded in the blood and carried on. The road to the truck had been taken from us and remade into absence. We found railroad spikes of cold where warm air should have pooled. Little eddies off winter threading the hollows in the field recorder. The hiss wore a rhythm not made by wind. A steady in and out that refused to belong to lungs and yet moved as lungs do. The forest laid out a second skin over our senses and tightened it by degrees until our own bodies felt borrowed. Every step measured itself against something that paced the same distance. Just beyond the glow of the Haderlamp, we reached the hunting camp with its tin roofs, slumped like traps, and the long table scarred by knives older than we were. A scatter of glyphs waded in the dirt near the threshold, not painted, not carved. Just traced with a pressure that rearranged soil grains into lines that held beneath a boot and refused a scuff. Some bent into crescents, others into angles, that met and did not reconcile. One circle had been broken at the east point and never closed again. Broken sigil meant a pact had been tested and not mended. The air there carried a slight sweetness under the iron. Like sap scorched on hot metal, we made a small fire from dead limbs and knotty splits pried from the table braces, not for warmth, not for comfort, but to own a circle of visible earth, while we thought of what the night had asked. The wood took flame with a grudging crackle. Bone fire, the mind offered, and would not take the words back, because marrow snapped inside these pieces and sent up a smell that did not belong to pine. Embers breathed slow at the center and licked a low light into the trunks around us. The camp's shadows assembled and waited like a jury. The first movement came low and right. A brush of ground cover pressed aside by weight that knew where to put itself. Eyeshine did not flare. Instead, the light on the edge of the fire scraped along fur too dark to reflect and found definition by subtraction. A forelumb placed itself with care. Tendons ridged against the wrist, nails pried into dirt to read the grain. The head rose into the frame and held just outside the reach of certainty. This was not discovery. This was presentation. A thing adjusting distance the way a craftsman adjusts a blade until it cuts true. Others answered it from the timber. Not a pack in the way wolves tally numbers and move by custom, more an order rearranging itself along laws older than the slope of a skull. The air thickened with the memory of rain that had not fallen. The recorder on the table breathed in an extra track all its own and began to write a line beneath the line. An undervoice that named something we would not remember correctly in daylight. He still waits beneath the hollow tree, it would say. Later, when we scrubbed the noise and slowed the wave until each pulse felt like a step in wet leaves, that we had come to collect sign and leave with theories. The night had come to collect us and leave with something truer. Silver lay in a kit bag for reasons inherited from other hunts and other stories, and it passed from hand to hand until the weight of it felt theatrical. When the nearest shape shifted sideways through brush and the moon lit the ridge of its shoulder, the metal in our palms died to the temperature of river stones and held there, inert and unimpressed. Silver won't work, the old men had told nobody and everybody at the same time. Because this is not a curse that learned its manners from books. Choice arrived without ceremony. Flee and leave the forest to its arithmetic. Turn and become part of the tally. bind and accept a clause we would not fully read. The circle at our feet pulsed with heat, as the bonfire found new breath, and the broken sigil at the east point drew our eyes until we understood the opening was not a mistake, but an invitation. A line could be closed, a pact could be written, in a script of heat and ash and held in place by blood that wanted to keep its shape a little longer. The nearest figure swayed forward and back with a patience that made the dark feel older than it had any right to be. The front limbs tensed without crouching, as though standing was the transformation, and all else was simply consequence. The back legs stepped to adjust, and betrayed the compromise in their design, bent for a kind of speed not needed here. It drew breath, and our teeth answered with that deep ache that had followed us from the bowl, gums tightening, as if they remembered another mouth superimposed upon our own. A werewolf transformation belongs to cinema. A Dogman attack belongs to soil and tendon. The difference is not important when you are the thing being measured. We closed the circle at the east, and fed the last of the wood into the center. The fire answered in a low blue lift at its base and a red gloss on top, the color of warnings painted on old maps. Red moon swam through the torn cloud ceiling and drew a thin vertical bar of brightness down the length of a rusted stovepipe, a blade of light that found the ground and cut it in two. The undervoice in the recorder thickened until the waveform looked like a jaw closing around a phrase and refusing to open again. Every howl is a name forgotten, the forest had taught, but a bound name can be kept if it is shared. We let our blood mark the closing where the soil refused a simple heel print. It soaked fast, taken by earth that had been waiting for moisture warmer than rain. The nearest shape halted with one forelimb raised, nails hovering over the cut line as if reading it by touch. The others kept their positions under the trees, not approaching, not retreating, a ring of patience stitched into the night. The choice made itself, because sometimes survival is not flight but agreement. The circle tightened and the air opened, and the second skin loosened enough for breath to find its size. The camp exhaled with us. The shapes withdrew in long, unhurried arcs, not turned away by fear or fire or metal, but nodding to a rule restored. The recorder rolled on, and the thinned to a thread that could be followed into morning if we dared. The red moon slid an inch and found another angle through cloud and smoke. The embers settled into a steady glow that felt like a heart deciding to continue. Somewhere behind the ridge, something heavy lay down for the first time since dusk and did not rise. The pact was not victory. It was a reprieve written in ash and old breath. The howl did not come. The night kept its teeth, and we kept our names for one more turn of the sky. Morning did not arrive. Lights seeped into the forest in the same way smoke creeps into a closed room, slow and directionless, carrying with it the weight of what had already happened. The camp was quiet except for the low hiss of the recorder still spinning, its tape no longer catching words but holding the faint pulse of something that refused to let go. The fire had died in its sleep, leaving a dark print in the soil. The closed circle, visible only to those who had been inside it. We did not speak about the shapes we had seen. There was no language that could make them smaller. Instead, we moved through the slow work of dismantling camp, our hands stiff with cold, our eyes drawn constantly to the tree line. It felt wrong to turn our backs, wrong to look away from the place that had chosen to let us go. Every sound carried meaning now. The groan of the tin roof as it cooled, the slow, deliberate shift of wind through the cedars, the pop of frost cracking under the weight of a crow landing too close. The path home began in silence. The forest did not return to its earlier shape. The air still carried the metallic thread of the night before, faint but insistent. Each step away from the camp felt less like leaving and more like being watched from behind, an unseen gaze following with patience rather than pursuit. It was a sensation too steady to be paranoia. This was not fear chasing from the shadows, it was the memory of a bargain breathing at our heels. Down by the ravine, the mud still held the crescents from where the nearest shape had halted at the packed line. They had not softened in the night. The edges were clean, the depths still damp. as though the weight that had made them had only lifted seconds before we returned. A branch nearby had been peeled bare of bark from tip to trunk, not gnawed, not clawed, just stripped with the precision of a blade. The pale wood beneath caught the light and glared back at us like bone. Farther on, near the hollow tree, the marks we had seen days before were deeper now. Sap had bled and dried, leaving amber scabs along the gouges. The cavity inside was darker than the morning around it, the smell of wet hides still clinging to its breath. Something had been there since we left. The soil inside was churned, and at the back, barely visible unless you knelt. A single print had been pressed deep into the earth, too long in the midfoot, crescents in the fore, the mark of the one who waits. The wind funneled into the cavity, carrying with it a low, uneven sound, as if something down in the dark had learned to speak through the hollow. The words slid out with the weight of damp soil clinging to them. Every click delays the change. For now, the land gave no other signs, no rush of departure, no sound to carry our names away. Only the stillness of a place that had accepted what was given to it. We reached the clearing where the truck had been, and there it was again. Its frost-caked windows facing the tree line, as if it had been watching for us. The sat phone lay on the dash, switched off. No sign of the one who had taken it. No trail to follow, just the cold and the impression of tires that had not moved since the night we arrived. We left without ceremony. The engine turned, the forest stood its ground, and the ridge fell behind us in slow folds. The recorder hissed quietly in my lap, playing back nothing, yet holding the weight of something in the silence between sounds. A kind of breathing too measured to be our own. I did not turn it off. I could not buy the time the road unwound into open land. The pact felt less like a choice and more like an anchor. Whatever had watched from the trees now lived in the spine, in the teeth, in the dull ache behind the eyes when dusk begins to gather. The others would speak of this differently if they spoke at all. Some would call it survival. Others would call it surrender. I knew it as something else entirely. A step across a line that will not wash out. No matter how far you travel from the place it was drawn, the howl never came that day. Not while the sun climbed, and not while it set, but its absence was not mercy. It was patience waiting to be answered, waiting for the next time the circle would be opened. And deep in the hiss of the recorder, faint but there, a whisper uncoiled and slid into the room like cold through a cracked door. One breath, long and steady, carrying the shape of a promise. We are not done. Night finds you differently once you've walked out of a place that lets you live. It's not just the dark in the sky, it's the quiet inside you that doesn't belong to you anymore. The road home dissolves behind, but the feeling doesn't fade. It rides with you, in the corners of your sight, in the way every shadow seems to lean forward when you pass. The pact is not left in the soil, it comes with you, stitched into the marrow, waiting for its own hour to speak. The hollow tree stays in memory, not as wood and bark, but as a mouth that will open again. The red moon stays behind the eyes, rising in every reflection. The bowl, the gouges, the shapes that moved without rushing. All of it lives there, unchanged, as if the moment never ended, only stretched itself thin enough to let you step out. And even now, in the dim stillness of whatever room you've chosen to sit in, you can feel the same pressure in the air you felt on that ridge. The same weight in the silence. The same cold, patient measure of breath. You play back the recordings, and hear nothing at first but static and wind. Then a shift. A murmur too deep to belong to a human throat. The kind of sound that wears the shape of words without needing them. The kind of sound that knows it doesn't have to shout to be heard. Beneath it, the faint tick of claws on a surface you can't place. You turn up the volume until the hiss becomes a tide, and in that tide, something moves. He still waits beneath the hollow tree. It's not a voice you remember hearing, yet it knows you, and it carries the same cold you breathed in those woods. The circle you closed in the dirt may have bound the night, but it did not bind what the night put inside you. You've brought it forward, into streets and houses that never knew such weight. Into rooms where the air used to be ordinary. Into dreams that used to dissolve when you woke. It doesn't dissolve now, it waits. It waits for cloud to peel back from the moon. It waits for you to walk down a road alone. It waits for you to hear that first low sound in the ribs instead of the ears. This isn't survival, this is inheritance, and you can dress it in reason, or call it by the names you learned before you saw the truth. But when the light falls wrong, and the wind holds its breath, you'll know the line you crossed. You'll know the forest still knows you, and you'll feel it, that pull to look over your shoulder into a place you cannot see, where something patient and tall is standing just far enough away to make you think it might not be there. The hour will come again, but not here, not now. It will come when you've started to believe you've been spared. When you've begun to think the pact meant escape, and when it comes, it won't ask permission. It will remind you you were marked, you are still marked. The pact isn't over. It's only begun to breathe. This isn't entertainment. It's a bloodline archive. Join the pack, subscribe before the next full moon rises. Asterisk. And for those who hunger for more, step deeper into the shadows with our Ultimate Werewolf Horror playlist linked in the description below. In the world of horror, the scariest things happen when you least expect them, and trust me, you don't want to be left in the dark. Welcome to the darkness.